So hey everyone, this is another CODEstantine meetup. Welcome. Today we have Gary Garfield with us talking about PHP 8 and what's new in PHP 8. But before we do that, let me give you a quick of introductory stuff that you should be aware of. I'm the host for today. I'm Nikola Cvetkovic, the founder of Emito, a no-code business messaging hub, which allows you to send messages via SMS, Viber, and multiple other channels without any writing any code, as well as product hive of full-service product SaaS product development agency. And I'm the host of today's meeting. For Larry in particular, he'll be giving his lecture and we'll be doing the questions in the end. I want to welcome you all to another CODEstantine meetup, a series of online events organized by No Limit Hub, a nonprofit from Niš, Serbia, which hosts the biggest developers community south of Belgrade. So we decided after 5 physical conferences, which are the traditional event of No Limit Hub, to also open it up for online events to host some of the people from all over the world to give lectures on interesting talks and kind of add some variety to it. Today we have Gary talking about PHP 8. He's coming from Illinois, right? Chicago, judging by the companies you were in, Larry. So I want to urge you all to register on the CODEstantine website. We'll be releasing all of the previous talks, which there have been already, I think, 10 on various topics too, and we'll be sending the links to all the registered people on CODEstantine website. So go there, make sure you follow CODEstantine on multiple different social platforms as well. I want to give special thanks today to Better Collective, our sponsor for today. And Better Collective Niš is part of a Danish media group, Better Collective, which is a leader in creating educational platforms in the iGaming industry. It was founded in 2004 as a startup in Denmark, and today has around 450 employees who work all over the globe. I think there was like maybe 8 to 10 different offices, including Niš, Serbia. So the office in Niš was opened in 2016, and today has 170 employees. So I want to give a big shout out to Better Collective, our today's sponsor, for making this talk happen and supporting No Limit Hub and CODEstantine community. So at the end of the event or during the talk, if you'd like to drop out, but I would suggest you keep it till the end so we don't interrupt this talk. The guys from Better Collective will have their own stand. So on the left, you see the expo booth. You will be able to go there and kind of get to know them better. And now that the official kind of introduction is off, I want to introduce Larry to you guys. And he's been building websites since he was a sophomore in high school. And it's longer than he likes to admit. He says how he likes to say it. And currently a staff engineer with Typo 3 project. For those who don't know, Typo 3 is one of the well-known CMS tools. As much as I'm informed, I know a lot of people in DACH region, so German-speaking countries are using it quite a lot. Not that maybe popular on other places, but it's built on PHP. And Larry has also been heavily involved in the past on multiple Drupal projects, as well as kind of consultant and contributor, and is a member of PHP FIG core committee and has authored several books on PHP development, including Thinking Functionally in PHP and Exploring PHP 8. So welcome, Larry, here. Thank you for taking your time to talk with our community and share your brief overview and intro about PHP 8. We all know that it's been advertised as kind of the biggest change in PHP since it started. A lot of improvements, a lot of tools that kind of are new age and kind of modern and what's expected from a modern programming language, which was kind of maybe lacking at some point and was kind of the main disadvantage of PHP in the past versions. So a lot of it coming in PHP 8, a lot of speed improvements, but I'm not the expert in that. You are, so we are all really excited to hear you talk a little bit more and give us this crash course or fast introduction into what's new in PHP. I'll leave the floor to you, Larry. I'll switch off my camera also to not take much of a screen real estate. You go ahead. If there's something, I'll jump in, but I'll try to keep jumping in to the late unless there's something really necessary in order not to disrupt your flows. That's how you prefer it. So here you go, and we're excited to hear this.
All right. Thank you, Nicola. As I said, we're going to talk about PHP 8 today. If you would like to follow along at home, I just dropped a link to the slides into the chat window. As mentioned, my name is Larry Garfield. You may know me online as Krell. If you want to make fun of me on Twitter during the talk, that's where you do so. I generally encourage it. As mentioned, I'm a staff engineer for Typo3. It's one of the large PHP content management systems. A longtime member of the PHP Fig core committee. I've worked on a couple of PHP core RFCs, mostly not stuff for 8, but for 8.1. And I'm the author of 2 books on PHP worth mentioning, Exploring PHP 8, which is basically the book version of this talk that covers even more than I cover here, as well as Thinking Functionally in PHP. Yes, functional programming in PHP is a thing. You can do it, and I've got a whole book telling you how. So got links for those dropping into the chat as well, if you are interested. Exploring PHP 8 is free. And I'm going to raffle off a copy of Thinking Functionally at the end of the talk, so stick around to the end. So let's talk about PHP. Actually, quick question for those in the chat. Who here is a PHP developer, and who here is just not a PHP developer, but here to see what PHP is up to these days? Let me get a sense for the audience here. While you're answering that, in the past couple of years, PHP has been developing in leaps and bounds. PHP 7 brought return types, scalar types, the spaceship operator, null coalesce, anonymous classes, and a bunch of other features that didn't fit here. 7.1 came out a year later, gave us the iterable type, nullable type, void returns, lots and lots of improvements to the type system over and over again. 7.2, not as exciting. Honestly, the only thing in it that was interesting to me was the object type hint. 7.3 was not as interesting, frankly. 7.4, though. PHP 7.4 brought us short lambdas, gave us typed properties, null coalesce assign, and one of my favorite named features, array splat. PHP 8, which came out last fall, has enough in it that it's going to fill an entire talk and an entire book. So let's get into that. Because really, PHP 8 is the biggest release of PHP since 7.4. PHP is a very exciting language. What can I say? So what's new? Well, let's start with improvements to the type system. The type system in PHP has been improving dramatically in the last several versions. At this point, PHP has the most robust type system of any major scripting language. The languages that have better type systems than PHP are all compiled languages, which means they're in a completely different category of language. So if you like typing, PHP is the scripting language for you. We now have union types. Instead of typing a parameter or an argument with a single type, you can now list multiple possible types separated by a single pipe, which means we can now pass an argument that is an array or a string to this parameter, and then we can do with it what we want. In this case, I'm just going to force them always to a string and then to an array and then do whatever. But you can vary the logic as you like. Another common use case for that, I want a number. I don't care if it's an integer or a float, and I can return either an integer or a float depending on what I'm doing. So say that. It could be an integer, it could be a float. Another useful example, you can return different types depending on what your logic is. For example, if you're taking a request object, an HTTP request object, you can declare that your function may return a modified copy of that request, or it's processed it into a response. This allows us to then have only two possibilities to deal with when the in the return value, which means it's really easy to build a branching pipeline that you just iterate over a series of callables, a series of functions, and know when to stop based on the return type. We don't have to worry about it being anything. We always know it's going to be one of these two object types, and that's it. There's also a couple of specialty unions. For example, you can now list null as a type on returns and parameters, which is equivalent to the question mark that we had before. You can now use false as a return type in a union only. You should never do this yourself. The only reason this is here is some of the older functions in PHP standard library are designed to return a value or false on error. And that is bad design. Returning false on error is bad design, period. There is no exception to that statement. But we've got those old functions in the standard library, can't really get rid of them. So it's there to support that. Never use that yourself. What you can use yourself, though, is the mixed type. Is a union of basically all other types, including null. This is roughly equivalent to just not declaring a type, which means there is now no reason whatsoever to ever not type a property or an argument or return value. Now, there's two use cases for mixed. One is this is legacy code. It could be a whole bunch of different values, and I can't really specify more than that, in which case use it temporarily to indicate that, but really you should fix your code because you want to have clear typing that helps reduce bugs. The other is you're writing some library or some class that works on an arbitrary value type. The type of that value doesn't actually matter, like you have a collection class or something. Then you can say mixed to say, I don't actually care what the type is, it's not relevant to me. So, those are the two use cases for mixed. We also now support static returns. In previous versions of PHP, you could declare a return type of self, which means same class as this class itself. But that meant that if you then declare add step on line 3 to have a return type of self, then anytime you implement that interface, the return type is going to say that interface, not the object. So if you're doing chaining, like this object is doing here, you would get a technically wrong return type, which is not helpful in your IDE. You can now use static, which means this class at runtime, not at compile time, so it pays attention to inheritance. So the add step method on the important task class on line 8, an IDE or static analyzer will read as returning an instance of important task, not an instance of the interface, which lets you have just more accurate static analysis. Another fun improvement is the new stringable interface. We've had the ability to type, to have an object that has a toString method on it for 20 years, 15 years, something like that. In which case that object will automatically get converted to a string if you use it as a string. But then the string type hint was added, which doesn't actually allow for objects of type string. It only allows for real strings. So that was a problem. In 8.0, there's now a stringable interface, which you can then use to say, hey, this object has a toString method. Combine that with union types, and so we can now say this function will take a for reals string or an object that has a toString method, so I can use it like a string. Another advantage here, this is fully automated. Any class that has a toString method automatically gets that interface applied, which means you can, in PHP 8, start using the stringable type hint, a type declaration in a function signature, and not have to worry about anyone else updating their code first. It works automatically. Now, you should put the interface on yourself once you're dealing with PHP 8-centric code, but it makes upgrading easier. That said, you should not use toString too much. It is there specifically for objects that have one and only one valid string representation, like, say, an IP address or a URL, where you can build it and then force it down to a string. There's only one way to do that. So that's the type system. As I said, this is the most robust type system of any scripting language on the market, and it just got better. And it's getting even better in 8.1 for next year. But speaking of strings, we also have a couple of new string functions that frankly should have been here all along, but better late than never. So we now have stir starts with and stir ends with, which do exactly what you'd expect. Given a string, does it start with this other string? Does it end with this other string? This used to be something you had to do yourself using stir pos in your string position. But now there's just built-in functions for it. More importantly, stir contains. Does this string contain this other string? You would think this is basic, but it took until PHP 8 to get it, which means you never have to make this bug again. This is how you would do a contains check in older versions of PHP. You would check the string position of some value inside a string, and it will return the position of that string or false. But then you have to worry about false and zero, which are sort of the same thing in PHP. And so if you have a equality check with two equals instead of a triple equal for identity check, then zero and false would get interpreted the same and you get bugs. And this was a very common error. Everyone in PHP has made this error probably multiple times in their career. You never have to do this again because stir contains is better and does that instead. So yay, fewer bugs, fewer novice bugs, even novice bugs made by advanced developers. These are all case sensitive and don't pay attention to encoding, but that's okay because it's just doing a byte comparison. So it's going to return true either way. If you want to do a type insensitive comparison, just call stir to lower or stir to upper on it yourself beforehand. There's no need to build too many variants into the API. You just assemble functions. Another aspect of PHP's type system is numeric strings. Numeric strings are a feature of PHP for a string value that is probably, it looks kind of like a number, so we'll just use it as a number and keep on moving. Which kind of makes sense when you're on the web because everything coming in through HTTP is a string. But it's also a huge ticking time bomb that can and has blown up in people's faces. In PHP 7.4 and earlier, 0 was equal to a string that began without a number. It is also equal to the empty string. A number is also equal to a string that begins with that number and then has anything after it. Leading spaces in a string that has numbers were silently trimmed and they didn't count. Trailing spaces sometimes count and sometimes don't, depending on what you're doing with it. It was bizarre. It also means that if you check to see if 0 is in the array ABC, well, inArray does a weak check by default, which means it'll check 0 double equal A, which we set up on line 1 is true, and so 0 is in that array. oh, good God. This was a mess. This is a huge mess. And it has been cleaned up in PHP 8. So now a numeric string is a string that, when trimmed of whitespace, contains only numeric values. That means digits, period, and the letter E for an exponent. That's it. And that is consistent in all contexts. It also means that during comparison, we can now be much more consistent about how values get compared. If you're comparing a numeric string with an actual number, then the numeric string gets converted to a number, and then those gets compared as numbers. So 42 less than a number, those are both numbers. If, however, it is not a numeric string, then they both get compared as strings. And so the string ABC gets compared against the number converted up to a string, and then they'll sort lexically instead. This actually makes way more sense given PHP's type juggling rules than the older version. So yeah, numeric strings actually mostly make sense now. If you're in weak typing mode, then passing a numeric string to a value that wants an integer works fine. In strict typing mode, it will give you an error. A non-numeric string that has extra flotsam in it like this will always be a type error at runtime, regardless of whether in weak mode or strict mode. Now that I've said that, everyone go declare strict types. You should be in strict mode 100% of the time. Non-strict mode is really only there for backward compatibility at this point. You should always use strict types, always. Who likes to play with matches? I like to play with matches, especially in PHP. This is a style, a particular idiom that I use a lot. I'm kind of fond of this approach. Ternaries, you can overuse them certainly, but say, I just want to assign this value to one of these two different options based on whether something is true or false. If the user is admin, then their display name has admin after it. If not, it has muggle after it. This gives you a nice, clean branching expression. It also encourages very simple expressions. You can't do anything really complicated in those expressions there. If you do, that forces you to factor stuff out to a function. The downside is this only works for cases where the check and the branch is a true or false statement. PHP 8, however, gives us match expressions. Match expressions do a strict comparison of any value against any expression. So in this case, we say, all right, if the user is admin, if that value is true, then this whole expression evaluates to that first string. If it evaluates to false, then the expression evaluates to that second string. There is no fall through. So unlike switch, you don't need a break statement. And it also must be exhaustive. If, in this case, it has to be true or false, but if you have a situation where you're checking a value that is not one of the provided values, it'll just error out. You don't have to worry about, oh, an unexpected value got through and so something didn't get set properly. That problem doesn't exist. Which means you can take switch statements that used to look like this, and we're just setting the same variable to different values. This is a very, very common pattern, and replace it with a match statement. So now, if var is A, message gets set to one string. If var is B, it gets set to a different string. Var is C, it gets set to a different string. And anything else, the default option, goes to that default string. These two lines do the exact same thing, but one is far more compact, far less buggy, far easier to get right, and easier to read. Fundamentally, switch is a procedural construct where you are executing a series of steps. A match statement is a functional construct where you're mapping input to output. It was pitched as a simpler switch. I think it's more accurate to describe it as a more powerful ternary or a more compact way of writing a bunch of if-else statements. You can also have compound arms in the match. So in this case, if the operator is plus, minus, star, or slash, then we will echo out the string basic arithmetic. For a percent sign, we echo modulus. For an exclamation, we echo negation. Any other value, if operator is not one of those 6 values, an error gets thrown because you did it wrong. If you want to do something more complex than just an identity match, then you can match true against any arbitrary check you want. So in this case, if count is between 0 and 10, then size gets set to small. If count is less than 50 and didn't match the previous check, meaning we know it's greater than 10, then it gets set to medium. If it's greater than 50, it gets set to huge. Anything else, meaning match the size must have, or the count must have been smaller than 0, will throw an error because it's not matching anything. This is a much more compact, error-resistant way of writing branching logic. I've already been using this a ton for my PHP 8 code. I love it. From the same person, actually, we get null-safe methods. Now, sounds like you're all developers, mostly, or you were developers at some point. And so you know that null is a terrible thing. Null is the billion-dollar mistake. You know not to use it. You know that you should, if you're coding with null, there's a problem and you should try and do something else. But then there's other people's code who are not as good a developer as you are, who don't have as good an architectural mind as you do. So you still have to deal with null. And if you don't know if something is going to return null or not, then guess what? You have to check. Which means, all right, get the user by ID. If that's not null, all right, now we can get the address off of that user. If that address is not null, we can get the state off of that user. And we end up with the stupid, triangle of death here in your code, just dealing with null. This is gross. This is just totally ugly and gross, and I've written code like this, and I hate it, and now you don't have to. In PHP 8, we get a null-safe operator for methods and properties. This one line does exactly the same as the previous slide. Call getUser with a value. If that returns null, state gets set to null. If not, call getAddress on it. If that returns null, set state to null. If it actually has a real return, check the state property on it and return the state property or null if it's not set. So all of that gets condensed down to this one simple line. It also short circuits. It evaluates left to right strictly. So in this case, if catalog is null, then we won't even bother calling get products, and we won't bother calling get seasonal type either. We just get null, and we're done. Note, this does not work on arrays. So if most popular returns something that's not an array, if it returns null there, and we try to access the 5th item out of that array that isn't an array, then that will still break just as it does in earlier versions. This is just for objects. Another limitation is that this doesn't actually tell you which item was null. If you don't care which item is null, that's fine. If you do care which item is null, this won't work. Instead, you want to use an either monad of some kind, which is a totally different talk that we're not going to get into. Maybe I'll give that talk later. Meanwhile, the language has gotten pickier. I support this. I want my language to be picky and catch when I do stupid things because that's its job. The whole point of a language that has types and can catch when I'm doing something stupid is so that I don't do something stupid in production. I do all of my stupid in development and the language tells me no, and I can fix it before it gets into production. That's the whole point. So a number of warnings have been promoted now and throw an error exception instead of just triggering a warning and moving on. For example, modifying a property of a non-object, something like this, will now throw a warning. Excuse me, throw an exception. Writing a scalar to a scalar value as though it were an array, will throw an exception because this is just fundamentally wrong. So catch it, tell you it's wrong, and then you fix it. Invalid argument to a for each. Trying to for each over something that is not for eachable will now throw an exception because, well, your code is wrong and you should feel bad. Fix it before it gets into production. An illegal offset. If you try to offset an array with something that is not a string or an integer, you'll get an exception. If you try to divide by 0, this is now an exception. Please don't divide by 0. Meanwhile, a bunch of other errors were promoted from a notice to a warning. Now, notices were in the past often ignored. A lot of people would configure the system to ignore notices. That's wrong. You want your code to run, at least in development, in super pedantic mode. Turn all error checking on, turn all errors into warnings, all warnings into errors, excuse me. But a lot of notices, basically most notices now, have been upgraded to warnings. For example, array offset on a non-array. This is now a warning, not a notice, so it's harder to ignore. Accessing a property of a non-object is now a warning. Array to string conversion, trying to use an array as though it were a string, is now a warning. Undefined property on an object is now a warning. An undefined variable is now a warning. Longtime PHP developers are probably blinking at that one. Yes, undefined variables are now warnings. You can no longer get away with undefined variables just floating around your code and just magically turning into null at random. That is no longer acceptable. They are now warnings. The engine will yell at you for that. Please go fix your code. That is where bugs come from. That is where security holes come from. You cannot get away with that anymore. Some of you are probably cheering. Some of you are probably very upset to hear that. But either way, this is the future of PHP. And so you need to account for undefined variables are now warnings. There's also a lot more commas. This is just a nicety. What do I mean by that? Well, back in 2017, this gives you some insight into how PHP is developed. Back in 2017, there was a proposal on RFC to allow trailing commas in function arguments when you're calling a function, in function declarations, groups namespace statements, implements clauses for interfaces, the use clause for traits, the use statement for closures, class property lists. There was one big RFC for these with a separate vote for each one. And the way PHP works, any vote has to pass by 2/3, a 2/3 majority, in order to be accepted. Only one of these passed. Which one? Group namespaces. The one that no one actually uses. I have never actually seen someone use group namespaces in practice. So that was the one thing that passed because PHP, I don't know. For PHP 7.3, however, there was an RFC just to allow a trailing comma in function arguments. Now, mind you, there had been a standalone RFC for this all the way back in 2013 that had also failed. This time, though, it passed 30-10. Why? I have no idea. Because PHP. In PHP 8, there's another RFC to allow trailing commas in function definitions, and that passed 58-1. Another RFC proposed allowing trailing commas in the closure, the use statements of a closure, and that passed 49-0. Why? I have no idea. I mean, I'm happy about both of them, but PHP is just weird. It's developing PHP is weird. But that now means you can do this. If you have a function or a method, same thing, then on your last parameter, you can have a trailing comma, and the lexer doesn't care. That's perfectly fine. In previous versions, that comma would be a syntax error. It is no longer a syntax error. Have fun. Same thing for a closure. For the non-PHP people, PHP for multi-line closures currently requires you to explicitly specify what variables you're going to import from your scope. And that list now you can also put a trailing comma on. Because It's just a little quality of life improvement. But now we get to the really big stuff. We get to my personal favorite feature in PHP 8, the one that I am most happy about. I love all of them, but this is my personal favorite. Constructor promotion. In earlier versions of PHP, you'd have declared properties on an object, and you can have a constructor which takes parameters, and you can assign those parameters to the properties in the object, which means you're repeating every one of these things 4 times. You're specifying theme, users, and module 4 times, once in the property, once in the constructor's method signature, and then twice in the line that assigns it. This is so much horrible, terrible boilerplate. And yeah, no one liked this. I knew people who refused to do dependency injection in PHP simply for this reason. They're wrong, but just because of how cumbersome and annoying this was, they refused to do dependency injection. They no longer have an excuse, because in PHP 8, you can now compress that all into this. In the constructor signature, you specify the visibility, public, private, or protected. And this expands out to the same thing as we saw on the last slide. These mean the exact same thing in practice. As far as the engine is concerned, they're identical. But this requires 1/3 as much typing. There's now no excuse to not use dependency injection. It's now trivially easy. Also, note that trailing comma on line 6, this is what prompted that, because with constructor promotion, we saw, oh, we're going to be listing our arguments to the constructor vertically a lot more often. So let's add a comma in there to make it just easier on diffs and easier to type. You can also mix and match. Just because you're promoting values, you can still put a constructor body in there that does whatever you want. You can also have some constructor arguments promoted and some not. That is completely fine. The ones that are not just go into the constructor body and you can do with them as you please. The one thing you cannot promote are arguments that have a callable type. And there's implementation reasons for that. Mainly for complex reasons, you cannot type a property as callable. You can use closure, but not callable. So you can't type a promoted constructor property as callable either. Aside from that, though, use this for everything. Especially for value objects. Making a value object that's just a bunch of properties, a product type essentially, is now stupidly easy. Just this class alone, we now have a new class that you can instantiate with those properties on it, with that visibility. The constructor works. We'll see more of this in a bit. Arguably, you should make, if this is going to be part of your public API, you should make those private and add methods, but that's use case specific, which one makes more sense. But this is now all you need to do to declare an object. And that is fan-freaking-tastic. The amount of typing that saves, I just wrote a class earlier today where I had to do manual assignment to object properties. It took me so long. I love this. This alone is reason to upgrade to PHP 8. But wait, there's more. We also now have much better support for metadata. For the PHP developers in the room, doctrine annotations are in core. This is the best way to put it. Different syntax, but all of the functionality of doctrine annotations are now built into the core system. The syntax was kind of borrowed from Rust. So if you have a string hash, bracket, something, that is an attribute. As a side effect, that will get rendered as a comment in older PHP versions because it begins with a hash. Only 8 and later will recognize that as anything meaningful. So you can go ahead and put it into your code now. It does not break backward compatibility yet. It just doesn't get used in earlier versions. Attributes have no intrinsic meaning. They are simply metadata available through the reflection API that you can then do as you wish with. As you wish, you know what I mean. They can be strings, arbitrary strings, but most of the time you want them to be classes. You want to define these as classes that you can then load with parameters and do all kinds of stuff with. As a concrete example, I'm going to show Tukio. This is an event dispatcher library that I built as part of the PSR 14 event dispatcher standard from the PHP Fig. For those non-PHP developers in the room, the Framework Interoperability Group, PHP Fig, is kind of the United Nations of PHP. It's the PHP standards body for anything in user space, not the language itself, but user space standards and conventions. So you don't need to worry too much about what's going on here. Just look at the attribute parts. So in this case, it's a way to register a listener on a provider. Listener is just any callable, a function or a method or whatever. And you would normally call add listener with the name of the callable, the name of the function, a priority, an ID, and a class for it to listen to. And the last three of those are optional. But that's a lot, and most of that is bound to the callable, bound to the function. I wanted to find that information on the function, not when I call add listener. Okay, so let's do that. We'll first define a new attribute. The way to define a new attribute is just make a class and give it the attribute tag of attribute, which is itself a class, just baked into the language. And we can define a constructor that takes whatever parameters we want. I'm going to make them both optional. And note here, we are using constructor promotion. This is all we need to do to make a listener attribute that we can then use. And because it's just a class, it can inherit, it can implement interfaces, it can have methods on it. You can do whatever you want with that object. It can be arbitrarily complex or arbitrarily simple. In this case, I'm just going to keep it very simple. And also note, on line 10, we've got that trailing comma. All of these things tie together. It's wonderful. We can also restrict it and pass in additional tags that say this attribute can only be used on functions and methods. If you try to use it on something else, you'll get an error. You can target an attribute at functions, methods, classes, properties, constants, or arguments. You can in fact target a parameter of a function or method, which gives you even more precise control than doctrine gives you. So attributes are more powerful than doctrine annotations. Now we use that tag on the function. We say hash listener and then an argument to it. That's just a class, so we still have to import the class name. Those arguments that we pass in there map directly to the constructor. The first argument in the constructor is ID, so we're passing listener A as the ID. All of that is just metadata that does nothing until we look it up ourselves. So let's look it up ourselves. This is a little bit oversimplified code, but we say, all right, we've got this function. We're now going to call the reflection API, new reflection function, to get back a reflection object that describes that function. A lot of languages have reflection APIs in some form. We're now going to call get attributes on that reflection function object and tell it we only want attributes that are instances of the listener class. So you can put multiple attributes on the same thing. We're only interested in ours. If some other library says to put some other attribute on there, cool, that doesn't matter to us. We only want our attribute. And that gets us back an array of reflection attribute objects, still part of the reflection API. Then for each of those reflection attribute objects, we call new instance, and that gives us back a listener object. So now the attributes value on line 11 there is an array of listener objects. The listener object we defined. we now have that metadata and we can do whatever we want with it. In this case, I use it as substitutes for passing arguments into the function, to the method registering the listener. You can do other things too. For example, in Symfony, for those not familiar with PHP, this is one of the large PHP frameworks, web frameworks. They have a route annotation that you can use to declare this method is a controller, so wire it up to the routing system at this path with this name. It's been using doctrine annotations for 15 years. Now you can use attributes instead. And in fact, because attributes and annotations, the old annotations library, both work with just arbitrary classes, the same class is used for both. So the syntax and the API is exactly the same. But what you couldn't do before, if you look at line 8, we're also tagging the argument as current user. That's information that can get used by whatever system is instantiating the object, by your dependency injection system, by your dispatcher, by whatever, to specify what value should get passed in there. So you can now do fairly robust metaprogramming in PHP in native syntax with a trivial API to work with it. It's really nice. I've been working with it the last couple of weeks for a project at work. I'm a fan. I'm a big fan. One note, if you put a attribute on a promoted property, does that apply to the property or to the argument? Porque no los dos. It could have gone either way. The decision was made to have it apply to both, which I think was the correct decision. And finally, the pièce de résistance. Arguments. Who likes arguments? I like arguments, at least if they're friendly arguments. These are friendly arguments. This is not a friendly argument. What am I filling an array with 50 0 times? Or 50 100 times or 150 times? What's 0 mean? I don't actually know. Oh, fill from 0 100 times with the value 50. That's what it means. All functions in PHP now support named arguments as of PHP 8. The argument name is just the name of the parameter in the signature. It is optional, and you can mix and match in the same function or method call. You can have some that are positional and some that are named, as long as the named arguments come last. Named arguments can happen in any order. So if I don't remember what the order is, or I just want to document it, what they are, the order doesn't matter. I can, put value first. This is totally fine. Note, you can also, this is another case where having a comma at the end is helpful. Just again, the quality of life improvement, the little things. But this is not allowed. The positional arguments have to come first, then named arguments. So you could do 0 value count, you could do 0 count value, but you can't put a positional after a named argument. It also supports variadics. This is the splat operator. Technically, it has some fancier name, but splat is the name that everyone uses because that's a much better name. If you take an array and do ... into a function call, then it takes the values in that array and splats them out and calls the function with the first argument, the first element of the array as the first argument, the second argument of the array as the second argument, and so on. That still works. If, however, you use a named array, an associative array, then it will get called as named parameters. So the order no longer matters, which lets you do some really simple dynamic argument calls where, if you want to call a function with some number of user-defined arguments that are coming from different places, you build up an array, you splat it into the function, and you're done. You don't have to worry about the order or the index number. No, named array, and you're done. So much easier. But the really big use case, probably the number one use case for named arguments, are value objects. We saw before that mail object that had a bunch of different properties. This is another example of the same thing. A URL object. URL has a lot of different pieces to it. With constructor promotion, we can define it all like this. So we just have a bunch of arguments to the constructor. They're promoted to real properties. Cool. We can also add methods on there if you want, or make them public. Up to you. But the problem here is I don't actually want to specify all of the arguments. Sometimes I may want to, but how often have you created a URL yourself where you cared about the authority or user info section? Not often. I'll specify the host and path, and that's it. I don't care about scheme. It should always be HTTPS. I may want to specify a fragment, but not a query. So should I try and reorder these to what I think is the most likely order? But that's going to vary by use case. Yuck. Which means in older PHP versions, if you wanted to create a new URL, you have to do something silly like this and repeat all of the default values. What are those first two nulls there? I have to go look it up. This sucks. In PHP 8, though, new URL with host that, path that, fragment that, and everything else gets the default value. In fact, I can go ahead and just make it vertical to make it easier to read, and that's super easy. So I can now, with no redundancy, create a value object or create a value object class and then create instances of it with no redundancy in any order. Everything is named and self-documenting. Everything is type safe, so you no longer need to pass an array as the argument to pull things out. That is just gone. You never need to do that again. This replaces that style. This is fan-freaking-tastic. I admit I'm a bit biased because about a year and a half ago, I published a blog post. There was discussion about how to improve how PHP works with objects and make value objects easier. And I put out a blog post saying the two things we need are named arguments and constructor promotion. All of these other weird proposals that people have are unnecessary if we have those two things. And fortunately, I was persuasive enough that Nikita Popov then went and implemented both features. I had nothing to do with them actually happening, just encouraging them to happen. But I'll take it. So, fantastic. Value objects in PHP are now stupid easy. You can also use them for attributes, because an attribute is just a constructor call to a constructor. So it works the same way. Named arguments there. This is probably the second most common use for named arguments, I'd say. It's totally legal for it to be multi-line like that. You should not overuse named arguments. In practice, still 98% of the time, I'm using positional. That's fine. But for cases like this, where you're defining a structure, this is so much better, so much nicer, so much more self-documenting. Of course, there's the most important use case, the absolute most important use case for named arguments. You no longer care about needle versus haystack. PHP gets a lot of flack because array functions put the needle first and then the haystack when you're doing a search. String functions do it the other way around. There are reasons for it, but they no longer matter. You don't remember the order? Specify it by name. Now you're documenting it, and it doesn't matter. Is that the correct order for an array? I don't know. I don't care. It's actually not. But it doesn't matter because I now have it defined right there which one is which. Problem solved. So anyone who still tries to hate on PHP about its order of arguments, they need to stop because that problem is now solved. Go away. One caveat, though, bear in mind, this does now mean parameter names are part of your interface contract. So if you have an interface or you have a function that has arguments to it, the name of those parameters is now part of your API because anyone could call it with a named argument. And that named argument, well, if you change the name, that argument is going to change. So be aware of that. But so far, it hasn't been a problem in my experience. Just something to keep in mind. Oh yeah, and this new thing called a just-in-time compiler. There's really no code to show for this. It's an advanced configuration. The idea behind a just-in-time compiler is PHP, like JavaScript, like Ruby, like Python, is compiled from source code on the fly to bytecode. That bytecode is usually held in memory. And then that bytecode is essentially a very low-level scripting language that gets interpreted at runtime. A just-in-time compiler analyzes the code as it runs and recognizes patterns and converts portions of that very low-level scripting language down to native machine code on the fly. The idea being then your high traffic parts of your code base get faster over time as the engine is able to rewrite them essentially into a more efficient version. Java has had this for a while. JavaScript, most of the major JavaScript engines have a JIT engine at this point, and now PHP does as well. It is disabled by default, and in practice, it will probably not have a huge impact on your typical web request. Because of PHP's shared nothing architecture and your typical setup, it's probably not going to have a big impact on your WordPress site or your Typo3 site or your Symfony app or something like that. However, static analyzers, machine learning, a persistent daemon built using React PHP or AMP or something like that that uses promises as a persistent running process, those could see a huge benefit. The Nikita Popov, who is the author of PHP Parser, which is a PHP parser written in PHP used by all the static analyzer tools, said he sees a 50% performance improvement with the JIT on the PHP parser library. So this will have benefit in some places, not all. You probably are not going to use it in your day-to-day work yet, but it's there and it should help in the future. It also, combined with the FFI support in PHP 7.4, gives PHP a way to get into the machine learning game, into the static, the heavy number crunching game, the scientific computing game, because the code itself can just get faster. So if you've previously ignored PHP for performance reasons in high computation situations, you should look again, because there are now enough tools in there that it's going to not be as slow as it has been in the past. Slow being a relative term. PHP is actually the fastest of the major scripting languages under normal circumstances. And now it has the potential to be even faster. In short, in summary, for those who have been checking email all this time, you know who you are. In PHP 8, you need to write about half as much code as you used to in the past. And the code you do write is going to be considerably more self-descriptive. And this is a win for everybody. Undefined variables are now always going to be a warning. So go fix your undefined variables. And you can ignore all the haters who talk about needle and haystack ordering because it's no longer a problem. That problem is now solved. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Happy to hang around and answer questions for as long as you've got them. Check out the links for both of my books. Exploring PHP 8 covers everything I talked about here and then some. It's sponsored by my previous employer, Platform SH. Thinking Functionally in PHP is functional programming in PHP 7.4 and later. And you can raffle off a copy of that. The way we're going to do that, I'm going to ask a trivia question, and whoever puts the answer into the event chat first wins, and then send me your email address by Twitter, and I can get your coupon code for it. So the question is, PHP has two styles of array syntax: array parentheses list of values, or bracket list of values bracket. The short version was introduced in what PHP version?
Can you repeat the question just for those who might not hear it?
In what version of PHP was the short array syntax added to the language?
feel free to write it in the event chat. We have a question. We'll address that later. So feel free to write your guess on the question. You can type it in, Larry, as well. Dražen is saying 5.4.
Dražen is correct. 5.4 it is.
Okay, Dražen, you're the lucky winner.
Okay. So, Dražen, send me a DM on Twitter, just @Krell, and I can, with your email address, and I can send you back a coupon for a free copy of Thinking Functionally. And with that,
awesome.
Floor is open for questions for the next 25 minutes if you got them.
Awesome. So guys, feel free to shoot questions for Larry, as you've seen his quite hands-on engaged in everything that's happening and new stuff that's been rolling out on PHP. So also your chance to maybe request some features kind of off the books for him to vouch there with the big
I promise
PHP
nothing.
guys. Yeah, he cannot promise, but cool. I have one question to give some time for people to write down their questions. So a couple of things that kind of the comma at the end is I think genius, and I don't know why it took like 20 years for people to realize that kind of their code breaks every time they try to rearrange something. But I think that's the biggest improvement in PHP 8.
PHP is weird sometimes, just its development process. It exemplifies the bazaar rather than cathedral style, which means great ideas come from all kinds of places, and sometimes things just don't make sense.
Yeah.
So trailing arguments like that, or trailing commas like that in array definitions, those have been supported for 20 years. I don't know that those were ever not supported, frankly. Why it took until last year to get them on function definitions? Because PHP. I have no answer.
Yeah. So my question is, like, there definitely seems to be a lot of kind of shortening of code and the way you kind of primarily kind of define certain things, and of course, like, you can kind of now use it in a way of you would use a kind of strongly typed language. So how does this impact existing application? Let's say one running on PHP 7 point something, that, let's say 7.4, that needs to kind of transition to 8.0, for example. Does that mean that everything will break completely, and that you have to redo all your function definitions? How about the external packages that you're using, which may have been designed the old way? So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. All of PHP's typing features are opt-in. You can write PHP 8 code with no type definitions anywhere, and it will run. I recommend against it, but it is all opt-in. So if you have a function now that hasn't changed since PHP 4 and has no type definitions in it at all, nothing changes for it. You're good to go. That's typical. PHP spends a lot of time trying to ensure that well-behaved code continues to work from one version to the next. The catch there is well-behaved. So, for example, if you have code that has lots of notices in it because it was not checking for undefined variables and undefined array keys and so on, then in previous versions, you could turn off notices and just ignore those errors. In 8, you can't ignore those errors anymore. They've always been errors, but now you're actually going to get called out for them. So you have to fix those. That's fairly easy to do in most cases. When I started working on Typo 3 earlier this year, the first thing I worked on was PHP 8 compatibility. 99% of what I did there was simply adding defaults. So, do this value, x equals this value out of an array, question mark, which is the null coalesce operator, some default. And I just added about 100 of those in various places, and we were fine. So that it's a simple mechanical process. It's possible you may have code where the the numeric string change might have a subtle change in behavior. Probably not. And if you do, it's because you had a bug in the first place. And we're now just catching that bug and calling it out for you. So generally speaking, updating from one PHP version to the next is a matter of set your container or your CI system to the next version, run all of your tests. If there are some notices, go fix them individually. They're fairly trivial in each case. Very often there are none. With a lot of libraries, there's no issue at all, especially if you've been writing well-behaved code, you've been using a static analyzer already that's already called out these issues. And then you're good to go. Uptick on new PHP versions or uptake has gotten much, much better in recent years. 8 is already, I think, on par with 7.4 or getting close to. So yeah, upgrading PHP versions is now a routine task, not a monolithic, a humongous task. And yeah, they go to great lengths to ensure that well-behaved code continues to work pretty much indefinitely. So Typo 3, the one I work on, it began life in PHP 3 in 21 years ago now, something like that. And sure, there have been people working on it, but it still runs. And new versions come out and the minimum version gets raised and we start using new features that break compatibility with the old version. But the old code, aside from caveats like that, stays working indefinitely.
Cool. Good to know that. So it's safe to try at least.
Absolutely.
To upgrade a lot of benefits that could come out of it. So Stefan asked a question. He says he's glad to have a chance to hear more about PHP 8. He wonders why some features are blocked on WordPress. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not sure what you mean by blocked on WordPress. PHP internals doesn't care what WordPress wants to do. WordPress, for its own reasons, continues to support insanely old versions of PHP that have long since been abandoned by everyone except WordPress. They've got their reasons. I don't want to get into that debate here. I believe there were some complaints that the named argument support annoys some people in WordPress because it makes the API surface larger. But that's a WordPress problem. WordPress runs on PHP 8. So if you want to run WordPress on PHP 8, you absolutely can do so today. That's not an issue. So maybe if you want to follow up with clarifying, I'm not sure if I understood the question, but
Stefan, feel free to follow up with a little bit more details on what you meant by that. For all of you who want to check out our sponsor of today's talk, Better Collective, they're on Expo as well. Will be after they're there already, but will be also after the questions. So make sure you drop in there and check them out. Dražen, a lucky winner. Well, not so lucky, a knowledgeable winner of your question. So he says he joined late, but's not sure if you already covered which PHP 8.1 feature are you looking for. By looking for, I'm assuming like which one is he excited about the most?
Yeah.
If I understand.
For 8.1, so 8.1 is coming out this November, late November. PHP always comes out late November or so. It's a tough call between enumerations and the read-only property. Now, read-only is not what I would have wanted. I would have wanted asymmetric visibility. Instead, we got read-only. We may get asymmetric visibility in the future. The read-only attribute is a modifier flag you can put on a property of an object, and then it can be set. It has no default value, and it can be set once from inside the object, which means you can now, like, good example here. If we go back, Here we go. That's the slide I was looking for. So instead of saying private string scheme, blah, 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 you could say public read-only string, blah, 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 blah. You no longer need to make the value, the property private. You can make it public, allow people to access it, because other code can't modify it. It can only be set once from inside the class, generally in the constructor, although not necessarily. And you now don't need getters. You can just take this class as is, throw a few extra keywords on it, and pass around a URL object with public properties that's safe, and you know that no one's going to modify it out from under you. That's the read-only property. That's coming in 8.1, and I already have use cases for that I'm looking forward to for Typo 3. The other is enumerations, mainly because this is the one I worked on myself. I worked on a couple of RFCs for 8.1, and only one of them got in, unfortunately, and that was enumerations, which I did not write the code for. I wrote the text of the RFC for. Ilya Tovolo did the actual work for it. But PHP now has object-based enumerations. So I don't have a sample of that offhand, but you can now define limited enumerations. So the enumeration, different languages do enumerations differently. In some languages, they are basically just fancy constants or fancy integers. In PHP, we took the approach of them being a layer built on top of objects, which is similar to what Kotlin or Rust does. So you can say this, I have a direction enumeration. So I have an enum with possible cases, north, south, east, west. You can now type a parameter or a return as direction, and then the only possible values you can pass to it are direction north, direction south, direction east, direction west. That's it. You can put methods on those, but you cannot add more to them. You can be guaranteed those, that is the complete list of possible values. And there's an enormous number of use cases for those. I'm looking forward to them. I'm also looking forward, hopefully we can expand the functionality to full algebraic data types in 8.2 and with pattern matching. So there's always work in progress, but enumerations I think are going to be a huge boon for just good data modeling along with read-only. Good data modeling allows you to eliminate so much code because values or states that are invalid that you shouldn't get into become impossible to represent. And so if you can't represent the state, you don't need to write the code to deal with getting into that broken state in the first place. All of the error handling just kind of disappears into your data definitions, and that just makes for better code entirely. This is why I'm such a huge fan of strong typing systems, and why I love that the typing system in PHP gets better with every version.
Cool. I mean, there's a lot of stuff we can talk about with PHP, and some of the, especially some of the packages which are kind of specific to PHP version 8, and which kind of come with a lot of improvements and like PHP and serverless. I'll just like to quickly touch on that. So how do you see the kind of PHP going into serverless? Do you think it's a viable path at all? And what's the state of it? And I'll finish with that and just try to keep it within the time frame so that people also have the time to visit the stand as well.
Well, before I answer that, Drajan has one other question about multi-line short closures. I support that RFC. There's still some work that needs to get done. Hopefully that'll come back in 8.2. I also wrote the text for that one to help someone else who actually wrote the code for it. We'll see what happens. So he and I were collaborating on that. But I'm very much in favor of making functional code easier to write in PHP. As far as serverless goes, it's funny you say that, because what most people say around the PHP space is, we've been doing serverless for 25 years. Where have you been? Serverless is reinventing what PHP already does in other languages in the most complex way possible, and then slapping a very fine-grained metering on top of it. So yeah, There are tools like Bref that
Why
let you
do you
use.
why do you say that? Because like you still have to load the whole PHP application in order to write to run a specific function. So
And you
where do
do.
you see a parallel with serverless?
So first off, define serverless. Serverless. So I used to work at a hosting company that did container-based hosting. Define serverless. It's a marketing term, not a technical term. What normally typifies what people say about serverless is very short scripts that do one very simple thing and then exit and don't take up any resources until the next time they're called.
Yep.
Guess what? That's what PHP FPM has been doing for 25 years. That is PHP's model. If you have a big application like Symfony or Drupal or Typo3 or WordPress, then yes, that one script loads a lot of other files in order to do what it's doing. That's not an architectural difference. That's just, it happens to be a big script. You can write a serverless Python script that loads 50 other files to get its work done, or loads one other file to get its work done. You can load a serverless Node application that is all one 20-line file, or loads 100 other files to get its work done. That's the same in any language. Are you going to run Typo3 serverless? No. Are you going to run Django serverless? No. Are you going to run a small single-purpose script written in any of those languages serverless? Sure. And you can write that in any of those languages. And that's exactly how PHP was designed to work in the first place in the 90s. Bridging PHP to the overbuilt, overly complex serverless frameworks that Amazon or Google have, there are libraries doing that. Bref does that for AWS. Google, I believe, built their own. And Google specifically, and I'm happy to say, uses the PHP Figs PSR7 standard for request response objects. So good on them for getting that right. But yeah, serverless PHP, it's almost too easy for them to bother supporting, therefore they don't. It's kind of what it comes down to, because you already were doing that. Serverless is adding PHP-style capabilities, runtime capabilities, to other languages that never had it in the first place. So yeah, serverless PHP, absolutely a thing, and you don't even need Amazon to do it.
Cool. I think we have to wrap it up. So thank you, Larry, again for your time and for sharing your expertise in this presentation with our community. I'd like to thank everybody that attended the meetup, and want to invite you to join the expo on the left and check out our sponsor for today, Better Collective. Thank you all for coming, and see you at the next event. Make sure you follow CODEstantine and No Limit Hub on multiple different channels, so you are notified when we have the next speaker lined up, and we will be kind of releasing all of the past 10 talks that we had with different people online as well. So make sure you follow the channels to get access to those.